Hi, Rick. Thanks so much for being with me today to talk about your new book. So, you're a Harvard Medical School physician. You spent like what 25 plus years working at Spaulding Rehabilitation Hospital in Boston. You've got dozens of research articles published in peer-reviewed journals, and all of that gives you enormous credibility in conventional Western medicine. So, what inspired you to write a book about the seemingly far-flung topic of energy medicine?
Well, first off, let me say thank you for inviting me here and having this conversation because it's something I like to talk about. And as old friends, it's also fun to have this format to go over stuff. So basically, you're asking me, I think, where and when did I go off the deep end?
Yes, but for many of us, that's where the swimming is the best.
Yeah, good way of putting it. Yeah, I mean, I don't really know. There wasn't like a what do you call it, a road to Damascus type of event that woke me up. But as far as writing the book goes, being retired has allowed me to do that. As you mentioned, I was at Spalding for over 25 years and lived in the suburb of Boston that allowed me to do that. But it got uncomfortable living there for a bunch of reasons. And so my wife and I moved out to the much more rural western part of the state about 10 years ago. And I sort of gradually tapered down my clinical practice to the point where just before COVID, I had stopped seeing patients. And that gave me the time and the space to just kind of sit back and reminisce and mull it over and just wonder what was next. And I, just started jotting notes and how it is, one thing led to another. And there was a lot about energy medicine that I wanted to pull together. And I realized that the best way to tell the story was through my evolution, the story of how I changed over the years because it's parallel to a lot of the changes that are going on everywhere. I might have been a little bit ahead of the curve and in an unusual situation for it to happen, but it's the same processes at work. So I really got into it, and I have to say I enjoyed writing the book. The publishing, editing, distribution part was new to me, so taking a while to kind of get the hang of that. But I wasn't always interested in energy medicine. In fact, I started out a very conventional scientific sort of background. My dad was a research scientist. He was an organic chemist, and he studied what different compounds you could inject into rats to stimulate immune response. And it was, really nitty-gritty type of things, which I found very fascinating. I didn't have a particularly big picture view of things. Our family was culturally Jewish, but not observant, so there wasn't a higher power involved. I think, in a way, you could say science was what we worshipped, and that worked for a long time. I happened to be a good student, so math and science was my forte, and so medicine looked like a good direction to pursue. College, it was in the late '60s, early '70s, so there was a lot of anti-establishment sentiment politically, and I think the whole attitude of questioning authority really stuck with me. Back then it was political and Nixon was the bad guy and all this, but that whole attitude, you don't believe something just because an authority figure tells it to you, and that's held true in my medical training too. Um, I think the other important thing that happened in college was that, unlike President Clinton, I inhaled. And so I, experienced some altered states of consciousness. It wasn't like my life didn't focus around it, but just to get the sense that there's more, more to it than we were told. So that I wasn't ready for medical school. Took a couple of years off and traveled, and that was really the best thing I ever did. Partly I met my wife Doreen in the travels, and partly we opted to do overland to India type of thing, not as a spiritual pilgrimage, but just to see. And wow, it was just an eye opener because different people do things differently in all aspects of culture, including medicine. And, whether it's herbs or acupuncture, we got exposed to things that never heard about here. So I came back from that to medical school. And in a way, the trance had been broken. I think that's one way of thinking about it, that I wasn't so caught up as most of my classmates back then. It was very unusual to take time off before medical. So now it's more common, but back then there were only like 2 or 3 out of 100 who had taken time off. So I was different. I had learned how to meditate. I'd learned TM just before starting medical school. And I was very excited about it because, I could change the way I felt just by doing something simple with my attention. So I was kind of I don't know, ornery critter or whatever, because I was asking every professor, would meditation help this disease? Would meditation help that disease? And of course, back then in, 1975, nobody knew. There was maybe 2 papers in the whole literature on meditation. And that's one of the really inspiring things to look back now and know that there's like literally 2,000 papers on meditation. And you can ask that question about any disease, and some we know the answer to, some we don't, but everything's being researched now. So it's a totally different ball game. But that was my interest, what we were calling for our mind-body medicine, just the influence of thoughts and emotions on health. And honestly, even back then, that was a strange idea. How could your thoughts possibly affect your physiology? I mean, your mind is up here and your body's down there. And, it was really an odd idea. And so that was like a first step. And for me, that I got a lot of leverage from it. And it was very fascinating and I enjoyed doing it. Um, I did my residency in psychiatry because that was the only place where you could even talk about the mind and states of consciousness. And to be fair to psychiatry, back then it wasn't all about medications. It's changed a lot, a lot, a lot, a lot. But back then, learning how to talk to patients was really important in psychotherapy. And so I worked in the VA for a while with post-traumatic stress disorder, and it's a good experience, but we didn't really know what to do. But while I was there, a very key event happened. A friend invited me to a lecture on healing. Did I want to hear a healer give a talk? And 90% of me said no, because, healing, that's the laying on of hands, that's Jesus, whatever. And I had all these stereotypes, but it was only because I trusted my friend that I went. And that was Reverend Rosalind Briere. And, she was a clairvoyant healer from Los Angeles who actually had a good reputation in the medical community in LA. And she was very articulate and wise and insightful. And I would say within 5 minutes, I knew that this lady knew stuff that none of my professors knew. And she could really get to the next level of it because she was talking about energy. So that's where I really started to learn about it. At that time, she used to come to Western Massachusetts twice a year for 5-day intensives. And I was a regular. And we had a core group of about 40 or 40 so people who came every time and really got into it. And it was great. It was just so different because there were things you could learn about why someone got this particular organ disease at that particular time in his life, what you could do to undo the blockages and bring about healing. And it wasn't just labeling something a symptom and aiming some medications at it and sort of blam, 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 shooting down the symptoms. It was transforming. So it was really different, but very valuable, very valuable. And so that sort of set up like a parallel track where there was the medical model of what happens when you just look at the physical body, and also the energy model of what happens when you look at the energy body, because it turns out there's a whole structure to energy as well, as you well know, and you've written so eloquently about in your book and articles. So, but it wasn't well known, and I happened to end up in pain management program because that's where 2 things where it was recognized that stress played a role. It was also recognized that they didn't really know what to do to treat it. So anything was fair game. I happened to end up at Spalding, where they had a very innovative team-oriented approach with physical therapy, occupational therapy, and a lot of mental health input, psychiatrist, psychologist, social worker. So it was pretty unique. And at the time, insurance companies paid for it, but that's a whole other story. But we got to do stuff that couldn't happen in other settings. And it included things like acupuncture and therapeutic touch and Barbara Brennan stuff. And then when I learned energy psychology, that became my favorite treatment modality. And for people who may not be familiar, it's using your acupuncture points, tapping on the patient taps on their own points while they're reviewing upsetting events. It could be minor, could be major, but that combination of the energy plus the psychological review allows release of energy, which everybody has felt. It's that experience when you say something, you get it off your mind, get it off your chest, and you go, ooh, like that. That's an energy process, and it's a really important component to it. And it helped a lot. A lot of patients got better. A lot of patients, honestly, a lot of patients didn't change. There's some very, very stuck people. You can make incremental changes, but not
Yeah.
hugely dramatic. I got
Tapping,
interested.
sorry, tapping is a really important aspect of energy psychology, but energy psychology incorporates a lot of other, energy-based modalities as well. And I hope you're going to talk about your experience at Spalding with the patients that were experiencing pain in their missing limbs.
Yeah, that's that. Um, it wasn't a big interest of mine, but there is a particular pain syndrome that occurs after an amputation, where it's actually very common for a patient to feel like their limb is still there. And I had one guy describe to me how he in the early phase when he wasn't used to when he woke up in the morning and got out of bed, he used his normal way of getting out of bed and fell down because, as he said, this was his joke, not mine, because I didn't have a leg to stand on. And he meant that, his physical leg was gone, but it felt as though his leg was still there. So a smaller percent, maybe about a quarter of amputees develop very severe pain where the leg used to be or whichever part. And it could be tooth removed, mastectomy, and any part of the body can develop phantom pain afterwards. So I got very interested in this, and many people got better just with biofeedback and meditation, but there were a fair number that didn't. And one guy in particular, this was one of the key encounters in my career was he wasn't responding to the regular approach. So I said, "You want to try something different?" He laid down, I had him lay down on the examining table. I said, "Just relax. I'm just going to kind of smooth out the space around you." And I was doing what's called therapeutic touch. Now, actually, ironically, I didn't know it at the time, but it's like the animal magnetism approach of Franz Mesmer from 1780, because he had a very similar model of an energy field that his own personal magnetism would smooth out with these mesmeric passes. So, and actually for your viewers or listeners, if you just put your hands facing each other and start a couple of feet apart and bring them close and far and without touching, and close your eyes because you can sort of sense it better. At some distance, you'll feel something, which, for some people it's pressure or tingling or whatever. And if you play around with it enough, you realize it's not just an optical illusion or not an optical, a tactile illusion, that there is something valid about that sensation. And the way I came to understand it, and many people have, is that your energy field, your aura, your biofield has boundaries. And when you do this, you're sort of bumping the two edges against each other and you can feel it. So I was doing that kind of assessment with Jim and smoothing it out. And for some reason, I just kept going even over his phantom leg. I didn't consciously intend it. I wasn't curious about what happened. It's just force of habit. But that same pressure sensation was still there, even when I was over his empty leg. I was like 2 feet away from any physical structure. So I was kind of, whoa. And, the flip side of that was at the same time, Jim opened his eyes and says, "What are you doing, Doc?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I can feel you touching my phantom." So his invisible missing leg had some sort of sensory capability that could feel my hand the same way that my hand could feel his biofield. So for me, that was 100% proof that the biofield is real, objective, exists in space. And just because we don't have instruments that can measure it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So I was hooked. Working with him, we could actually smooth out the field, and he could feel it drain out of the bottom of his foot in a spot that he didn't know and I didn't know was an important acupuncture point. So, all the aspects of it sort of tied together. So from that point on, I got really interested in working with the biofield model and validating it. And turned out it's easier to work with it than to validate it. And kind of one of the side hobbies, it's not really a hobby, but pursuits now is working with a group of like electrical engineers and gizmo guys, I call them, to find a device that can actually take a picture of a phantom limb. It's not as easy as it sounds, and there are some very, very intriguing leads coming from research that was done like 40 or 50 years ago. People maybe remember some of the Curlian photography images where, they'd show a picture of a hand and you'd see this sparkly, what they call the corona around the edge of it that was bigger when you're happy and smaller when you're sad, things like that, which was fascinating. But then somebody had the idea, they did it with a lot with leaves too, and leaves that were given healing energy, their fields were bigger too. Somebody had the idea of cut off the tip and let's see what happens with that. And lo and behold, the corona stayed the same after the tip had been amputated. I have a copy of the book here that featured it. Hopefully it will show up in the image here. But this is the picture of a leaf that has had the tip cut off, the black part, and yet that, the lighting around it hasn't changed. So that has a lot of implications, I think. Partly it sort of counters the idea that the aura is some kind of emanation, like a glow from the body, like a light bulb emits the aura. It actually looks like it's the flip. It's the opposite. Like the biofield comes first, and the physical structure follows suit. And the analogy that's really helpful is an experiment that just about everybody did in seventh grade science, where you sprinkle iron filings on a piece of paper over a bar magnet, and out of the blue, lo and behold, they line up in this beautiful symmetrical geometric pattern that shows you where the magnetic field lines of force are. You can't see them with your naked eye, but they obviously exist. So the analogy to phantom pain, or the phantom leaf effect, as it's called, if you sweep away some of the iron filings from that piece of paper, the magnetic field is still there. You just can't see it. The filings line up in alignment with the invisible field. And I think the cells of our body are like the iron filings. They line up, they grow, they develop, they differentiate according to the invisible energy field, the biofield, which is acupuncture meridians, chakras, there's many aspects to it. So I think it's very similar. And medicine has just been focused on rearranging the iron filings without looking at the magnetic field under the piece of paper. And once you learn about it sounds funny, but once you learn about the magnet under the piece of paper and work with that, the iron filings will, go right back into place. So that was that, but the picture on the cover of that book was like 45 years ago, and it's been very surprisingly hard to replicate. And part of it has to do with the technology, and part of it, ironically, has to do with, or not ironically, just it's fascinating, but it has to do with the person who was doing the experiment, that he happened to have a certain knack or an affinity with plants that I've had feedback from other people who looked at the situation who say that it was his biofield that helped augment the effect. And other researchers have been, sort of too analytic and, and objective and not jumping fully into the situation. So that's one of the barriers. The other is technology that they actually use film cameras rather than digital cameras now. So we've done some trials with digital imaging that don't seem to work. There's some great, the top of the field type of biofield researchers working on this. John Hubacher is the guy who did the first round. Beverly Rubik of the Institute for Frontier Medicine, well, Gaitan Chevalier. So this the top people are working on it. Funding is an issue. So if there's any millionaires out there listening and you have a, 30, 40, $50,000 you don't need, you can just mail it to me. Well, mail it to Deborah, of course. But no, I mean,
I know
like,
nothing about this scheme. Um, yeah, I mean, it's such a great metaphor, the iron filings and the
yeah,
method and so forth really makes it vivid, the influence of the biofield. Um, one of the one of my favorite parts of your book was about team energy and the flow state. And although there's a lot to love about your book, apart from that, that was my favorite because, I mean, for me, it's a pretty novel contribution to our understanding of subtle energies. So could you summarize a little bit from that section of the flow and team energy and stuff like that?
sure. Well, I mean, it's actually nowadays a pretty common concept when somebody's in the zone, or that was the first term, or a flow state. And it's the focus of a lot of sports training and sports psychologists, but it happens in all different arenas, like a musician, when they're grooving, for example, or a writer when the muse speaks to them and it just kind of flows out of their pen. So it's a very common experience, but it's kind of idiosyncratic as far as when it's going to happen, who it's going to happen to, and why. So there's been a lot of interest in that. And it turns out my take on it is that there's a very important subtle energy component to it that basically the best resource on this was written like maybe I should look up it 45 years ago. Do I have it here? No, Michael Murphy, the fellow who co-founded the Esalen Institute, he was an avid golfer, so he got interested in human potential as it relates to sports. And he wrote a book called The Zone, Transcendent Experiences in Sports. And it was based on his interviews with a lot of famous athletes who described times when they could see what was going to happen next, or they could see the aura around an opponent. And they basically had these psychic abilities, at least for a while, that occurred when they're in the zone where their mind wasn't, analyzing and criticizing and judging like it usually does. So they had gotten into an altered state of consciousness that allowed them to perceive things differently. So Michael wrote out a whole list of it. He made some very fascinating comparisons to yoga and the abilities that develop in yoga. The Siddhi, Siddhi, a lot of them are paranormal type of things. But didn't and so the challenge has been how do you develop those abilities, and that's where the energy stuff comes in. In my work, I first focused on just the individual, but obviously when you interact with other people, um, your energy fields interact too. So that became one of the areas I was interested in. Ironically, what sparked it for me was as a sports fan, I'm not a particularly good athlete and have been in the zone maybe twice in my life, but that's an exaggeration. But I mean, it wasn't the focus of my life, but our region of New England is a little bit over the top when it comes to being sports followers and fans. The word fan, by the way, is short for fanatic, and that's pretty accurate for how we were when our baseball team won the world championship for the first time in 86 years a while ago. So I got caught up in that partly because it was just a good antidepressant for my patients to be caught up in that. But part of it was just fascinating how the team worked together and how certain people could be so in the groove at certain times that their performance was extraordinary. And fortunately, I had a cousin who's a filmmaker, and we teamed up to make a documentary about these kind of subtle energies in sports, with the Red Sox being sort of the case example. And we called it The Joy of Socks, which should have guaranteed it being a bestseller just in and of itself because it's a cool name. But It was a documentary that actually was on PBS, and people who are interested can watch it on YouTube now for no charge. Just Google The Joy of Socks, SOX. But a couple of things that we did were kind of cool measurements of the energetic aspects of what was going on. And one of them was based on the work of the Heart Math Institute in California, that they've studied the heart rhythm. And the heart's not a metronome, it's not just boop, 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 boop. The intervals vary according to your emotions, your breath cycle, and whatnot. And they found that if a person focuses on positive emotions like appreciation, it changes their heart rhythm in a way that becomes more coherent. That's the term that they use, heart coherence, which also increases your mind-body coordination. But so they had training programs where people could, it's very simple to monitor your heart rate just with a sensor on their fingertip. And people could learn pretty readily to get into that state of heart coherence. I was wondering what effect nearby meditators would have on somebody who didn't know how to do heart coherence. So we went to their physiology lab in California and set up a study where I was the guinea pig because I did not know how to do this process. I was hooked up to their recording device, and then I had blindfold and earphones, so I could not hear. I was in sensory isolation in the lab, and then unbeknownst to me, four meditators came and sat behind me, and at a signal from Roland McCready, the director, they began to do this meditation, and the idea was, let's see what happens to my output. And within like 5 or 10 seconds, literally, it was that quick. My heart coherence, as they call it, started to go up and up and up and up, and it's all there on the computer. And it was it was very compelling because it was a very vivid demonstration that emotions are could be entrained or resonant. Uh, you could compare me to a tuning fork. That these four tuning forks behind me started going, and I started to resonate with them. And the sports application is that when you're in a state of heart coherence, your reflexes are sped up. And Roland had the analogy that it's like taking 10 miles an hour off of the fastball that's approaching. The batter sees a 90-mile-an-hour pitch as 80 miles an hour. So he has a much bigger advantage in terms of being able to hit successfully. So that kind of stuff is starting to catch on in pro sports. There's actually a lot of sports training now focused on energy balancing to get into the zone because people are realizing that it's not just a mechanical thing about having your arm at the right angle and, weight training and stuff like that. There's something about the stepping back and allowing the energies to flow. You do your training until it's sort of automatic, and then you step out of the way more than take over. And so the energy piece has been really helpful in showing that. I don't know the numbers as far as how many teams actually use heart coherence or acupuncture or EFT. It's kind of a funny limbo that, for example, one of our colleagues in the energy psychology professional organization, ASAP, Association of Comprehensive Energy Psychology, a psychologist from Oregon named Greg Warburton had worked with their college baseball team for many years to the point where they were perennial either champions or in the finals of the National College World Series. And the players totally attributed it to him because normally they would be nervous when they went out there or, the pressure would get to them. And he taught them tapping regimens, and it was just them at the plate waiting for the next pitch kind of thing. And they won like 3 national championships and all, but they didn't highlight Greg's role. And there's 2 reasons. One is they didn't want to look like wackos because it's an odd sight to see the players on the bench all going like this, waiting for.
Tapping and
Yeah, it just didn't fit the narrative. And the other was, give the competitive advantage to their opposition. So there is good documentation for it, and it turned out that one of the Red Sox players that I interviewed showed us the regimen that he used because he had learned about it actually online. It wasn't something sponsored by the team. So my guess is it's much more common now but still not, what do you say, out of the closet or something. And that's changing too. I think there's a lot just more acceptance, acknowledgement of energy aspects in sports, in life, and in medicine too. You know, medicine has, just to go back to medicine, it's changed so much. One of the probably better known or best known approaches now is Reiki, which is a hands-on transmission of energy. And the Reiki people have volunteered their services in hospital settings. And it started as a pilot program in Boston, not my hospital, but another one, affiliated one, where they just came in the evenings and donated their time to patients and staff to give a free, 20-minute, 30-minute, whatever session. And the response was so positive that it grew by leaps and bounds to the point where they've given thousands and thousands of free sessions. And that has increased awareness dramatically. Our hospital for a while had a training pro. We sponsored the training program and funded staff to learn how to do Reiki, and all disciplines took part in it. But what really struck me was a lot of the doctors in training, that what they call the residents, took the program. At least a dozen. So there are at least a dozen physicians out there now who learned Reiki as in part of their training program, and that would have been, I couldn't even have conceived of it, back in the day. So that to me is another real important sign that the times are changing, and these things are, it's you feel when you have a treatment done to you, you feel something inside you that your mind is trying to figure out what's going on but can't. And I think that's really important to have that experience. It's as important as having, another double-blind controlled research study that documents a 42% change in chlorophyll levels. I don't, whatever. That the subjective experience can be just as important, if not more important, than the objective data. So combination of things is happening now that, there's a lot of institutional resistance, and the pharmaceutical industry does have a big role to play in medical education and practice, and the insurance companies, and just the profit motive really, uh, it plays too big a role. But there's a potential that these are very low cost interventions, and you don't have to buy fancy equipment, and some of the techniques don't even take that much training. Like for ASAP, they have a humanitarian outreach program where two of the senior trainers go to really trouble spots around the world where refugees and war-torn and whatnot. And they teach some of the community leaders, like teachers and nurses, how to do the simplified tapping protocol. And then all the villagers will get treated. And they have phenomenal results. And it's heartwarming, but it's amazing. But it's also, that stuff should be in the front page of the newspaper. And nobody's heard of it. If you're not a member of organizations like ASAP, you won't know about it. But it has such a huge potential because, unfortunately, so much of the world is it's like a global PTSD state right now. There's so much traumatizing stuff happening. So
Absolutely.
it's really important to be able to clear out and start afresh.
Yeah, and tapping is so powerful when it comes to trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder and so forth. So, Rick, your book spans topics ranging from the human energy system to, group consciousness, earth consciousness, global consciousness, and beyond. And it includes a critique of the flawed response to COVID. It includes stuff about, channeled information, sections addressing like crop circles and extraterrestrials, UFOs. All of this stuff could be considered risky topics, right? Like fringe topics because of the woo-woo factor. And so, like, what were the most challenging parts to decide to include in terms of your personal hesitation? Or, did you have thoughts of like potentially risking your reputation as a Harvard-trained MD?
Well, that's a good question. And could I have written this book 10 years ago when I was still in practice? I probably would have curtailed some of the crop circle stuff or the COVID critique. but the energy stuff, I had done plenty of presentations, and I had staff doing these kind of demos and things like that. But to be honest, I think being retired did give me much more freedom and flexibility. And also, it's like I didn't really care if I got excommunicated from Harvard or whatever the term is. It wasn't important for me to build up my resume for my next job kind of situation. And I had such a marginal role in it. It's not like I'm chairman of the department or anything like that. So I don't even know how many of the higher ups know about it. I've sent, info about the book to a lot of my former colleagues, and it's been surprisingly supportive. And, my hope is that because I don't present it in a, this is the ultimate truth kind of way, but here's something to consider, that more people will, whether it's off the record or on the record, will be open to some of these ideas. Because bottom line, it's just fascinating. Like you mentioned crop circles, and that's sort of my biggest extension. I've never seen a UFO, so I never totally got into that. But these are the patterns in wheat fields in England that form overnight, that some of the wheat stalks lie down and some of them stay up, and the overall pattern creates really complicated geometric designs that are, huge. Some of these patterns are like 100 meter, 300 feet across, and made up of lots of little circles. And in fact, actually just over my shoulder here, this is a picture from I can't figure out which way to move my hand. There's a crop circle calendar. Each month has one of last year's coolest pictures. So they're very beautiful and
And
awesome.
sophisticated, complex, and not easily replicated at all, despite
No,
despite
yeah,
what, you might hear in the mainstream.
yeah. The mainstream had a way of dismissing it by a couple of retired farmers said they just dragged a plank of wood around and smashed the stalks, but the wheat stalks are intact, and it's also awe-inspiring. So I have a couple of pictures of that, and anybody who's interested, you just Google crop circles, and there are images all over the place that are just fabulous.
Well, remember when you and I, along with a couple of other colleagues, we visited the International UFO Museum and Research Center in Roswell, New Mexico, a few years back. I think we all agreed it was a really eye-opening experience in terms of evidence, right?
Yeah,
Evidence
and
supporting the presence of extraterrestrials here. Um, Remember that?
I certainly do. I remember being surprised that so much of that information was being presented publicly, because most of it has been covered up. But there's exhibits showing how after the wreckage was discovered, what was covered up and what was revealed, and how they went about covering it up. And I was amazed that it was allowed to be out there. So again, there's plenty has broken through, and I think really we're in the times now where it's the dam is ready to burst on all this disclosure type stuff. Although it's sort of always two steps forward, one step back, it never quite gets there. But I really think that the next, I don't know what, year or something like that, there'll be more and more of the indisputable type of evidence. But yeah, that museum, it's not very well known unless you happen to go there. I mean, if you go to Roswell, it's kind of interesting because every shop has something ET themed about it, even though, the burger joint has an ET eating a hamburger or something like that as their logo. So it was, you can understand why they would do that, but there was also something very solid underneath it all.
It's true. It was a fun field trip. So, it takes time for, a book to go through a publication process with an established publishing company, such as yours. In retrospect, is there anything that either you wish you hadn't included in the book, or something in retrospect that you wish you would have included?
That's a good question. I think in a way, a book is like a never-ending project. There's always new things that happen that you wish had happened then you could include. I actually have started a blog on the website. That's the mysteryoflifeenergy.com. There's a place where you can sign up for the blog to incorporate some of the new things. And some of them are events, but it's just sort of where energy is part of the picture. And like with the recent solar eclipse out here in the eastern part of the country, there were some subtle energy aspects to that I was talking about. The one part that I did sort of put limits on was about COVID. I focused more on how our response was all drug oriented and vaccine oriented, rather than complementing it with how do we boost our immunity. And there's some very simple supplements and practices that would have had a huge impact on resilience and resistance to, and that was never mentioned. I did not go into,
And never allowed to be mentioned, really.
that may be true too, but I mean, even just somebody could just add on and, after you get your COVID vaccination, why don't you take some vitamin D and zinc supplements or something like that, or to focus on obesity would have been a big thing. But so, I talk about that in the book and a couple of articles I've written, but I didn't go all the way as far as where the virus came from and was it lab generated and how high up were the powers that were behind all this. Partly because I'm not 100% sure, and partly I just didn't want that to become the focus because that was so controversial that it would, I think, divert from what my major intention was. But it's not over yet.
Is there anything you want to say about that?
No,
Now?
I mean, I just an example of how fraught a topic it is the presidential candidacy of RFK Jr. All anybody knows about him is he's anti-vax. They don't know anything about
Which isn't
any
even true, but
right. That just the label anti-vax, that they don't know anything about the nuances to his approach on vaccine. Plus, they don't know anything about all of it. This is kind of what would be a very popular agenda if people got a chance to hear about it. And he's doing well with getting on the ballot in more and more states. So I think hopefully there'll be a fuller picture. I don't know whether he'll ever appear in a debate. That would be quite the thing with him and Trump and Biden. I don't know what will happen there. So I think
yes, I fantasize about that. I think it would be really interesting.
it would. But it's really interesting. There's so many unknowns right now. Things could go in so many different directions that at one level it's fascinating, at another level it's unsettling because you don't really know what's up. But yeah, so he's like one of those people that you can just see how the mass media, there are just some topics that are totally off limits, and I didn't try to push that. I'm pleased with the process, the way it's developed. I personally don't have a social media presence, which is what you need if you want to self-publish. And so, this company Inner Traditions has a nice catalog that they sent out. They have a website, and then they have colleagues and friends like yourself who are doing a piece to spread the word, and you're sort of my surrogate social media or something like that. Because I just could never get into Facebook and that's what. But like your skill with community activism back in Maui was really that's a very important skill to have these days, to be able to network and interconnect people on the same wavelength. So I appreciate
And to
that.
motivate people. And so that actually is my next question. Like, I'm sure with the publication of your book, I mean, it's full of information, full of, references, very credibly supported and backed up, and, with good testimonials from, credible sources and all of this. But like, what is it that you hope people will do? Like, what action do you hope people will take after reading your book? It's aside from just, having this amazing storehouse of information, what do you hope they'll do differently?
Yeah, I don't know. I hope it's more than just information for them to download into their database kind of thing. Because for me, the the highest achievement would be that people could look outside and see things differently, that basically we're all in this together, that there's this web of energy or consciousness or whatever you want to call it, and that we're all connected to it, no matter how much we may think that we're the good guys and they're the bad guys or whatnot. There's just so much of that polarization and us versus them mentality that even if the book just helps people to step back from that a little bit, I think that'll be really valuable. Because then from that state of feeling interconnected, then they could see what for them makes the most sense, what choice of action. Because it'll be different for everybody. It's not like you should vote Democratic or whatever. But in each person's own life, their actions will be colored by this insight. And it may just be that they're a little bit kinder to people, the person in front of them in the checkout counter, or, it could be tiny, tiny things like that, but everything has a ripple. And that's really one of the things that's been most amazing is the ripple effects. And there are ways to measure that too. There's a um, it's again, it sounds very strange, but out of Princeton University, the engineering department found ways to detect the influence of human thought on machines. There's no
The Pear
wires.
Lab, right?
Yeah, the Pear Lab, and those are some of the most science fiction-y types of studies out there. But they've been documenting it for like 40 years or something. So, in a nutshell, you can get a computer to respond to thoughts. You program a computer to basically flip a coin, heads or tails, ones or zeros, 1,000 times a second. And the normal stream of data is like, there's a little bit of fluctuation, but not much. When people meditate on the computer, they'll start to be noticeable trends in one direction or the other. So they made it portable and took the computers out into the field and distributed them around the world. And there are some global it's a global network that called the Global Consciousness Project, um, that is kind of taking the brainwaves of the planet continuously. And certain times at certain events, there are big, big spikes. And one picture that I have, actually, it was supposed to be in the book, but we've mixed up a little bit. But on the website, under illustrations, I can't remember what title it is, but a picture of this recording, this output data on what was called World Sound Healing Day a few years ago, which is a project started by Jonathan and Andy Goldman, who were sound healers, to have as many participants around the world as possible set aside some time that day for making sound of healing, whether it's a humming or chanting or singing or whatever. And the computer graphs for that day are way above statistical significance compared to the day before and the day after. So something happens. It's not like their sound was loud enough to be picked up by the microphone of the computers because they were miles away. And, so how it happens is one thing, but that it happens is such a strong inspiration to prove that we're all in together. So that, I guess that would be my main hope, that my book adds to the growing awareness that we are all interconnected and interdependent.
Well, that's a really beautiful note to end on, I think. Um, Thank you so much, Rick, for sharing all of your energy and information with us today. Really appreciate it. And do you want to mention your website once more before we close?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Here's here's the cover of the book. There's a very cool design.
Beautiful, yeah, it's a beautiful
Right,
image of the chakra system, the aura, and the radiatory energy of
right.
us, us
Yes,
humans.
of us humans. And the website is just thebooktitle.com. So the mystery of life energy.com. And there's a lot of resources, for example, how to view a video clip of that heart math demonstration they talked about. And related stuff, and just pictures too that I think really help to balance out the words. So I just want to thank you for the opportunity to talk with you, and thank you for sharing this with your peeps.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. Bye for now.